It's a moonlit night on October 17, 2005, in the Salah ad-Din province of Iraq. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, the 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Division is on patrol. Their mission is to ensure a vital supply route from the Balad Air Base remains safe. This area is notorious for what soldiers call red air, or what science call sandstorms. And this night is no different. The storm is so severe that it prevents U.S. aircraft from observing potential threats along the road. Despite the challenges, many leaders in the unit, including Sergeant First Class Alwyn Cashe, consider the road too important to neglect. This makes sense. Sergeant Cashe has always prioritized the mission and teamwork. The Oviedo, Florida native came from humble beginnings and often had to work together with others to survive tough conditions. And Cashe is not new to warfare. Shortly after graduating high school, he enlisted in the United States Army in 1988 and participated in numerous military conflicts, including Operation Desert Storm in the early 1990s. So there's not much you can throw at Sergeant Cashe that he hasn't seen before. However, warfare has evolved since the 91 version of the Middle East conflict. Open area battles have largely been replaced by military drones, building-to-building firefights, and improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. The mission calls for Bradley fighting vehicles, heavily armored infantry transports outfitted with significant firepower. In the combat pre-check, one of the Bradleys experienced a mechanical malfunction. This was the one Sergeant Cashe was originally assigned to. So he decides to get in the lead Bradley in the gunner's hatch, leading from the front a convoy of 17 soldiers and an interpreter. As a soldier, you are trained and prepared for a lot. The U.S. military excels at this. But in the fog of war, deception often prevails. An IED explodes underneath Cashe's Bradley, penetrating and immobilizing the vehicle, engulfing it in flames. Sergeant Cashe's uniform is now drenched in fuel. His men are trapped inside the Bradley. Now he makes it out of the gunner's hatch, but once he hits the ground, he draws enemy fire. Sergeant Cashe is in a precarious position. His men are trapped in a burning vehicle. He's being shot at, and his uniform is soaked in fuel. He has to think quickly. Lesser men will have folded under pressure. But as Marcus Aurelius once said, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. So this Florida native turned soldier knows what he must do and shows us what people close to him have always known. Sergeant First Class Alwyn Cashe is just built different. We come from innovators, heroes, and royalty. We are our ancestors' greatest hope. We face many challenges, but we mold that adversity into our greatest strength. We are the glue that holds a nation together and allows it to flourish. Welcome to Black is America, the podcast that highlights little-known African-American figures and stories that make our history come to life. I'm your host, Dominic Lawson. Episode 3, Alwyn Cashe, the American Sergeant. From the outside looking in, it's easy to think that commissioned officers, your lieutenants, your captains, and your lieutenant colonels, in the U.S. Army get all the glory. While many deserve considerable recognition, it is the non-commissioned officer, these are your sergeants, sergeant first classes, and first sergeants, or the NCO, that is considered the heartbeat of the Army. They are the drill sergeants that mold you from the time you get off the bus at basic training to the first sergeant you answer to at your final roll call. They are the unsung heroes, the mentors, and the ones that provide tough love when needed. And that is so much truer when it comes to the Black non-commissioned officer. I still remember being part of a live fire exercise with my weapon jammed in basic training. I knew the protocol, which is to perform the acronym SPORTS: slap, pull, observe, release, tap, shoot. But this was the first time I needed to perform that action in an exercise, and I panicked and buckled under the pressure. Observing all of this was Staff Sergeant Tyrone Kirk. Now, Sergeant Kirk stood about 6'3", 6'4", and was a solid 250 pounds, imposing to say the least. However, his demeanor was quite different. Don't get me wrong, he was tough, but he was approachable, warm, and downright funny. Imagine Bernie Mac with a drill sergeant's hat. So he's watching me fail under pressure, and he piles on. It's an onslaught of insults, jokes, name-calling, and more. I had never heard him chew out any other soldier like that before, and if I'm being honest, I think I was more hurt than embarrassed. But after the training exercise, he pulled me to the side. "Lawson, I know I was tough on you back there, but that's my job, because when you get to the sandbox, they will have no mercy on you." The sandbox is what Iraq is often called by military personnel. He explained that he needed to shake the jitters and nervousness out of me. Not if, but when I was deployed. But it was what he said next I didn't expect. His tone became softer. He sounded more like a dad than a molder of soldiers. "Lawson, man, you're not like most soldiers that come into my army. I can actually see you doing something else once you leave service. Just know that even then, you are going to be put in situations where you will have to perform. So whether that be the sandbox or a job interview in the civilian world, I want you to be prepared for whatever is thrown at you." I never forgot that interaction. And as I pursued the entrepreneurial life and made a name for myself in the podcasting world, it made an impact on me. I thought about him a few years ago and looked him up. I wanted to say thank you for him pouring into me that hot Oklahoma afternoon. But I'll never get that opportunity, because Sergeant Kirk went on to be with the ancestors on February 7th, 2017. I wanted him to know he made an impact in my life, and I'll never forget that, which is why I dedicate this episode to him, a man who only spent 9 weeks with me that changed everything. But Sergeant Kirk's legacy is just one of the many Black non-commissioned officers that have made an impact in the United States Army, making it arguably the most formidable fighting force the world has ever seen. There's Sergeant William Butler, part of the Harlem Hellfighters that we mentioned in Season 2, or hailing from the Sunshine State is Master Sergeant Juanita Wilson, retired, who, after suffering an injury to her arm in 2004, became the first African-American woman amputee from a U.S. conflict. Her resilience and leadership have continued as she now advocates for veterans, proving that the spirit of the non-commissioned officer never fades, on or off the battlefield. And that leads us to tell the story of fellow Floridian Alwyn Cashe, which is one of courage, sacrifice, and an undying commitment to his fellow soldiers. This is the tale that proves that for all the amazing professionals in the armed forces, there's nothing like the NCO, clipboard in hand, heart in the other, making heroes out of humans. Alwyn Cashe was born July 13, 1970 in Oviedo, Florida, to Andrew and Ruby Mae Cashe. He was part of a big family as the youngest of 10 siblings. They didn't have the finer things in life, but they had what they needed. The patriarch of the family was a hard-working man in construction who instilled that work ethic in his kids. He would tell his kids, quote, "Whatever you do, do it like you're putting your name on it." He led by example until his passing very early in Alwyn's life. It's not bad advice. Whatever you do, do it like you're putting your name on it. I might have to use that later. Now, Uncle Al was the adventurous type of kid. He loved to fish and hunt, and when you live in a place like Central Florida, you're set up quite nicely for those activities. And then there was the other stuff young boys try to do. You know, build ramps and jump them with your bike and daredevil type of stuff. He also would jump off the house just to see if he could. His siblings often teased his mom about being soft on Alwyn, Remember, he was the youngest of 10, so by the time his parents are a bit older, they may not have been as strict as they were on Alwyn's older siblings. But there could be another reason they did this as well. Risk-taking is something that goes hand in hand with leadership. But now that I think about it, given where Uncle Al grew up, risk-taking and forging your own path is a bit of a common theme. But who could I be thinking of? Am I thinking of Daniel Chappie James Jr., the Pensacola native who flew almost 200 missions in Korea and Vietnam? He was also the first Black four-star general in military history. And while serving as the commanding officer at the U.S. Air Force Base in Libya, he almost had to pull that burner out on Muammar Gaddafi when the Libyan dictator pulled up to the gate. Trust me, there's a whole story there. Check out the show notes to see what I mean. But nah, that's not it. Who am I thinking of? Who is it that a young Alwyn Cashe reminds me of? I swear it's on the tip of my tongue.
Our ancestors were some of the most fiercest fighters during the war.
During the Indian Wars?
Yes.
Wait, Indian Wars. Okay, I think it's coming back to me. Hey, Uncle Bud Crockett, speak on it a bit further with Emily Cartwright of 60 Minutes, the longtime CBS News program. Jog my memory just a little bit more.
Due to the fact that they knew if they were recaptured, they were going into slavery, back into slavery.
Okay, got it. Let me get you up to speed. See, Alwyn, like I said before, is born in Oviedo, Florida, which sits in Seminole County, referring to the Seminole tribe of Native Americans, prevalent in Florida, Oklahoma, and Mexico. That's who he reminds me of. The person I was trying to remember is John Horse and the Black Seminoles. Yep, you heard me right. There is a such thing as the Black Seminoles. And to show you what I mean, let's rewind the tape so I can show you the connection between that risk-taking spirit and Uncle Al. Man, Uncle Bud, you are a real one for that assist. I just love when the ancestors come through in the clutch like that. Okay, let's go right about here. It's Florida in the early 1800s. It's a wild, untamed land where Native Americans and runaway enslaved Black people found refuge. These two groups, seeking shelter from oppressive forces, the U.S. government, came together, formed a mixed society, having babies, and from that birthed the Black Seminoles. Now, remember during this time, Florida was not part of the United States, but owned by Spain. But the Spanish made a deal with the Black Seminoles that if they defended Florida, they were thereby defending the crown, so they could stay there in peace as far as the Spanish were concerned. So imagine a large community of Native Americans and Black people working together, thriving together, building families, but also heavily armed together. After the American Revolutionary War, as you can imagine, many Southern white people, particularly those who owned the enslaved, didn't like that at all. The reason for this, that if you were enslaved and ran away and found yourself in Florida, you would be able to live there and live your best life as a free person. And if you were a plantation owner out here trying to move this cotton and tobacco, and you primarily depended on free labor, that would be a problem. I mean, it's a personal problem, but a problem all the same. So in 1818, then General Andrew Jackson invaded Florida in an attempt to take it for the United States. And when he got there, he began murdering the leaders in the territory. Later, the United States would purchase Florida, and then General turned President Andrew Jackson will begin his infamous doctrine of the removal of Native Americans, thereby leading to something you probably are familiar with, the Trail of Tears. This prompts the Second Seminole War, a brutal conflict. It was the costliest of the Indian Wars, both in terms of money and lives lost. Amidst the chaos, the Black Seminoles, led by the charismatic John Horse, fought bravely, and for good reason. By this point, John had helped create the largest haven in the U.S. South for runaway enslaved people and led the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. In addition to that, they secured the only emancipation of rebellious enslaved people prior to the U.S. Civil War. Over the next 7 years, the U.S. government found out that the Black Seminoles were not an easy way and had to make a deal with them to end the fighting. The agreement promised that if they moved to Oklahoma, they would be left in peace, including those who had run away to be with the Black Seminoles. But as you know by now, sometimes the U.S. government be on that f***ery when it comes to keeping promises, which leads us to the point where U.S. Attorney General Nathan Clifford enters the chat. In 1848, the Attorney General said that the federal government never had the authority to recognize their freedom and that those who had been enslaved were in fact still enslaved. So not only did the white Southerners consider it open season on these Black Seminoles, but even some of the neighboring Native American tribes would attack them as well, as they traveled to and settled in Oklahoma. So John Horse knew he had to leave the state and ultimately the United States. Facing betrayal, John Horse and his followers embarked on yet another extraordinary journey. They formed the largest mass exodus of enslaved people across the United States, ultimately seeking refuge in Mexico. And here's the kicker. John Horse didn't just find safety in Mexico, he became a general in the Mexican army. And under his leadership, the Black Seminoles received protection from the Mexican government, creating a new haven for their community. The story of John Horse and the Black Seminoles is a statement to the strength and resilience of those who dared to fight for their freedom. It also proves that we got it right with the title of this show as it relates to aligning ourselves with Native Americans. Black truly is America. So yeah, that is who Uncle Al reminded me of. And it makes sense that he would graduate from Oviedo High School at 17, promptly join the Army the same year at the suggestion of a friend. It fit him, because to know Alwyn Cashe was to know that he was an outgoing and adventurous kid, but that didn't always serve him well. He often struggled in school and sometimes found himself in trouble with the law. So it's probably safe to assume that he was seen as a problem child, heading on a trajectory of not being a productive citizen. But as an education company, I think this is a great reminder of two things. First, little Black boys in schools are often written off as behavior problems because they don't conform to what is seen as, air quotes, traditional education. But just like everyone comes from different backgrounds, everyone also learns differently, which is why it's imperative for us as educators, mentors, and parents to meet kids where they are, to get them to where they are going. We should train them to be what they need to be for themselves later in life, not just what we need them to be for us right now. Because when Uncle Al got into the Army, he found his calling, but you don't have to take my word for it. Here is Cashe White, Alwyn's sister, proving my point.
He liked to hunt fish. He was all into the things you guys do, rappelling, jumping off of buildings when he was younger, jumping off the top of the house just to see if he could. I tell people he found his niche when he went into the Army because he was able to use all of his energies and the Army didn't stop him from doing anything.
And my second point is best summed up by the Queen of Jazz, African-American singer Ella Fitzgerald. Quote, "It's not where you come from, it's where you're going that counts." And for Uncle Al, he certainly was going places in his military career. He first started off as a supply specialist and then became an infantryman. 11 Bravo is the MOS, or Military Occupational Specialty. He proved his leadership mettle and became a squad leader, responsible for training the soldiers and team leaders in his squad. He loved it so much that he ultimately became a drill sergeant, wanting to teach, train, and mold the next crop of soldiers for the Army. But I'll get into that a little bit more later. Besides the positions Uncle Al would hold, there will also be the places he would be stationed and deployed around the world, even to help liberate a Middle Eastern country in the early 1990s. In the late 1980s, there was tension in the Middle East. Iraq, under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, had just emerged from an 8-year war with Iran. The conflict left Iraq economically devastated, with staggering debts, particularly to neighboring Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. So when you're a dictator with a God complex in a broke country that owes debts to the neighboring country, what do? You make accusations and you invade them. So Saddam Hussein, seeking to rebuild his economy and assert regional dominance, turned his eyes to Kuwait. He accused the Kuwaitis of slant drilling, extracting oil from the fields that Iraq considered its own, and of intentionally depressing oil prices through overproduction. So on August 2nd, 1990, Hussein's forces invaded Kuwait, swiftly overwhelming the small nation. The international community was quick to respond. The United Nations condemned the invasion and imposed economic sanctions on Iraq. This led the U.S. president to build a coalition of nations to liberate Kuwait, and he addressed the nation on January 16, 1991. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, George H.W. Bush.
This conflict started August 2nd when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait, a member of the Arab League and a member of the United Nations, was crushed. Its people brutalized. 5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
Operation Desert Shield was launched, marking the buildup of coalition forces in Saudi Arabia to deter the further Iraqi aggression. By the end of January 1991, U.S. troops had been deployed to the Persian Gulf alongside forces from 34 nations. Among these troops were thousands of African-American soldiers serving bravely in various capacities, from the front line of infantry to crucial support roles. And this would include Sergeant Cashe. Just 4 years earlier, he was running up and down the halls of Oviedo High School. But now, he found himself in the desert sands of the Middle East. But I don't think anyone was worried about how he would do there. Uncle Al was the type that trained vigorously and brought the fight to the enemy. Carlos Cashe, Uncle Al's brother, once told him about a conversation Alwyn had with an officer. The officer asked why, when he was in a danger zone, he was always out front. Uncle Al responded, quote, "I am at peace with myself and God. And some of these other guys might not have reached that point yet." That was the type of soldier you was going to get with Sergeant Cashe. But he wasn't alone in terms of others who looked like him in the sandbox. Historically, Black Americans have faced significant challenges within the U.S. military, from segregation to limited opportunities for advancement. However, by the time of the Persian Gulf War, African Americans constituted a significant portion of the armed forces, making up a substantial percentage of the Army as well. Their contributions were indispensable, and the war saw Black soldiers taking on prominent roles in combat and command positions. The military campaign was important on a different battlefield than one in the Middle East. American superiority when it comes to military prowess was the envy and fear of the world for most of the 1900s, particularly how it showed up during both world wars. But the Vietnam War was a different story. And after that, many around the world weren't sure if the Americans had what it took to regain the stature as the one you don't want to mess with. And the Iraqis were no scrubs when it came to war. At the time, they had the fourth largest army in the world, so the Americans had their hands full. And if America was going to regain its stature, it would have to depend on Black America once again, as it always has. And there is one person of note who is pivotal to achieving that secondary victory.
Let me turn now to the Iraqi army and the Kuwaiti theater of operations. As the Secretary pointed out, this is a large combined arms army. It has tanks, it has personnel carriers, it has air defense guns, it has very redundant, resilient communications between the different operating echelons of the Army.
This is General Colin Powell, the first African-American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Powell played a crucial role in the planning and execution of the Gulf War strategy. His leadership and strategic acumen were instrumental in shaping the coalition's approach, emphasizing overwhelming force to ensure a swift and decisive victory.
Our strategy to go after this army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
General Powell was a great military mind, creative, decisive, and it was on full display during Desert Storm. Not only was his Desert Storm strategy good, it was also overwhelming. I guess General Powell adopted the doctrine of Memphis rapper Gangsta Black. It's the world's thickest clique. Some people just don't like it. Let me explain what I mean. President Bush gave a clear objective: have a limited war with a limited purpose, to quickly and efficiently kick the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. Understanding the assignment, General Powell asked to double the fighting force from 250,000 to a whopping 500,000 boots on the ground. Some people thought this was absurd, but remember, General Powell was a veteran military leader with a great military mind. Every military training he has ever been a part of, he has mastered, which means, in his own words, quote, "I am great at my profession." And what were the results, you ask? Let me break it down. The war officially began on January 17th, 1991, with a massive aerial bombardment campaign, followed by a ground assault on February 24th. The coalition forces quickly overwhelmed the Iraqi defenses, and by February 28th, President Bush declared a ceasefire. Kuwait was liberated, and the war was over in just 42 days with few American casualties. Cashe would serve bravely in Operation Desert Storm, picking up many commendations, but his work was far from done, serving in Bosnia and Kosovo. But also during that time, he served in one of the greatest roles as far as this host is concerned: drill sergeant. I mentioned this earlier in our story. When you are a non-commissioned officer, you have the responsibility to your soldiers. You make sure they eat, train properly, and show up for duty. But many Black NCOs take it a step further. You also check on their well-being, make sure they call their mom. And if you were Sergeant Cashe, you go fishing with them from time to time and build that rapport. In those moments, you are not just an NCO. You are a friend, brother, a person you know will have your back if chaos broke out. And if you remember my personal story with Sergeant Kirk earlier, this is where I believe that Black father leadership style really took hold for Uncle Al. Not to mention, he ultimately had a wife, Tamara, and kids, but that dad role served him well as a drill sergeant and beyond. A first lieutenant that served with him once said, quote, "Cashe was always in dad mode in terms of taking care of his soldiers." Honestly, if the Army wants highly skilled soldiers with good morale, you can't go wrong with the Black drill sergeant who is also a father. According to a report from the CDC, Black fathers who live with their children are more likely than any other group to have their kids bathed, dressed, changed, helped to the toilet, and eat meals with them more than any other race group. Black fathers are also more likely to take their children to and from activities than any other group. And lastly, Black fathers are also most likely to help with their children's homework than any other group. From that, it's easy to extrapolate that if you want a highly skilled, highly professional soldier to serve our country and complete the mission, you want those Black NCOs and drill sergeants who are also fathers. And that love, care, and concern would be on full display in a familiar theater of war. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, George W. Bush, I know, deja vu, right? On March 19th, 2003.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
In the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, the devastating terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon reshaped U.S. foreign policy, placing a renewed emphasis on combating terrorism. President George W. Bush and his administration launched the War on Terror with an initial focus on Afghanistan to dismantle the Taliban regime and al-Qaeda. However, attention soon shifted to Iraq. The Bush administration, citing concerns over weapons of mass destruction and alleged ties between Saddam Hussein and terrorist groups, began building a case for military action. Central to this effort was then Secretary of State Colin Powell. On February 5, 2003, Secretary of State Powell delivered a pivotal presentation to the United Nations, laying out the U.S. case against Iraq. Using satellite images, intercepted communications, and testimonials from defectors, Powell argued that Iraq possessed WMDs and posed a significant threat to global security. Despite the controversy and lack of concrete evidence, the U.S. moved forward. On March 20, 2003, the Iraq War officially began with the launch of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The initial invasion saw a rapid advance of coalition forces, quickly toppling Saddam Hussein's regime. Among the U.S. troops deployed were a significant number of African-American soldiers, just like it was in the 90s. And as always, Sergeant Cashe would answer the call not once, but twice during this era. His sister Cassinal told him, "Don't go over there playing hero. You learn how to duck and come home." And of course, his response was, "I'm doing the job I was trained to do. I have to take care of my boys." This leads us to October 17, 2005, during Sergeant Cashe's second tour of the Iraq War. The soldiers, 17 in all with an interpreter, were tasked with a reconnaissance mission to ensure that a key supply route remained safe to the Balad Air Base. Normally, a U.S. aircraft would patrol the area, but a sandstorm took that option away. And in a pivot, 3 Bradley armored vehicles were called upon, as the route was often a place for firefights. Like I said before, Sergeant Cashe's vehicle that he was attached to was experiencing a mechanical malfunction, so he would hop in the first Bradley in the gunner's hatch to lead the way. One of the things I mentioned at the top of this story was the War on Terror brought about a new way of fighting. One of the tools used by the enemy was the improvised explosion device, or IED. The worst part of that, besides the blast, which can obviously be deadly, is the deceptive ways they can be planted. They could be anywhere: lamppost, a dead animal on the side of the road, or even a sidewalk. I remember hearing stories of a chunk of sidewalk being taken out, a device planted, and then the sidewalk be re-cemented to look untouched. And it would be that device that set off a chain of events near Samarra, Iraq. The blast instantly takes out the Bradley, the one that had Sergeant Cashe and the other personnel in it. It ignited a fuel cell, engulfing the vehicle in flames. One soldier would reach for the handle to get out, burning his hand. He was able to grab a breaching tool and was able to pry himself free. And once outside the vehicle, he fell to the ground and vomited. Not long after, he drew enemy fire as well. The interpreter couldn't make it out as he was engulfed in flames. Sergeant Cashe had a few minor injuries at this point, but he was drenched in fuel. However, he managed to make it out of the vehicle, drawing fire on himself. The first thing he did upon hitting the ground was look for his soldiers. "Where are my boys?" he screamed. "Where are my boys?" Sergeant Cashe is in a rough spot. He was under attack. His vehicle was down, so he couldn't get out of there. And more importantly, his soldiers were not accounted for. Sergeant Cashe had been in many tight spots, but none like this. We have discussed many themes in this episode, one of them being how the black non-commissioned officer are not just trainers of soldiers, but molders of men. See, you may think this is a war story, and to a certain extent, you're correct. But the story of Sergeant Cashe is deeper than that. This is a love story, a love of country, a love of service, and more importantly, a love of the men under his responsibility. You heard me say earlier that a first lieutenant said of him, quote, "Cashe was always in dad mode in terms of taking care of his soldiers." I couldn't have said it better myself, because on October 17th, on a chaotic Iraqi night, dad mode was activated. The other two Bradleys began laying down cover fire for Cashe as he started pulling out every person, one by one, from the burning Bradley. He started with the interpreter, who was on fire. Cashe put out the flames and got him to safety. Then the next man, same thing. He put out the flames, pulled him out, and got him to safety. Over time, as you will imagine, Cashe's fuel-soaked uniform caught on fire, but he didn't have time for that because his men was his top priority. Sergeant Cashe repeated this action, pulling out all 6 soldiers from the burning Bradley alive, with no regard to his own safety and well-being. One soldier watching said, quote, "I swear, it looked like a movie to me," sharing his utter disbelief at what he was watching Sergeant Cashe pull off and saving his men while being on fire himself. Another soldier said that Cashe's uniform was unrecognizable and had essentially completely burned away. Sergeant Cashe got everyone out of the burning Bradley, but his job was far from over. With the enemy now neutralized, soon a convoy will pick up the wounded and take them to helicopters so they can get further treatment at a hospital. The first sergeant ordered all the wounded to get on the helicopters and instructed Sergeant Cashe to be checked out by medical personnel. Sergeant Cashe ignored the order. In fact, he was running around checking on his soldiers, helping them onto stretchers, telling them they were going to be all right. Sergeant Cashe again was asked to be checked out by the doctors, and again he ignored the order. So the two of them actually got into a shouting match, but it was clear Sergeant Cashe was refusing medical treatment until his men retreated first. You may not know this if you have never served in the Army, but there's a soldier's creed that is recited often. There's a line in there that is pivotal: "I will never leave a fallen comrade." And Sergeant Cashe took these words to heart as he argued with the first sergeant. This is something that will get you in serious trouble with serious consequences in the military. Sergeant Cashe didn't care about any of that. All he cared about was taking care of his boys. Finally, he did relent a bit and was checked out by a doctor, but even then he was checking on his men, ensuring that they were getting proper medical treatment. Once he saw that all his men were being tended to and on the helicopter to evacuate, Sergeant First Class Alwyn Cashe, with over 72% of his body covered in 2nd and 3rd degree burns, walked off the battlefield of his own volition and eventually, after much pleading, got onto the stretcher to be evacuated. Science would explain this as adrenaline as to how he was able to pull off this feat. But I think there's more to this, because on October 17th, 2005, Sergeant First Class Alwyn Cashe proved that you should never question the heart of a non-commissioned officer with the objective of getting his men home. In the coming weeks, Sergeant Cashe and his men would be evacuated to Germany and then to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, to recover from their wounds. Unfortunately, the interpreter died the night of the attack. But as for Sergeant Cashe's men, all of them made it stateside alive. And just as he did on the battlefield while lying in the bed recovering himself, he was asking about his men, wanting to know updates, and telling anybody who would listen to tell his men to keep fighting. At this time, Sergeant Cashe was close to the 20-year mark in the military, which would make him eligible for retirement in 2008. That was the plan for him: do his 20 years and then retire. I imagine Sergeant Cashe spending his retirement fishing, hunting, and doing something that could use his skill set. Maybe teaching soldiers as a civilian or heading up the JROTC program at his old high school back in Oviedo, Florida. I would have loved that for him. He would have been great at that. But while in the hospital, recovering from his injuries and once again displaying his commitment to service, he pledged to re-enlist when the time came and push off retirement a bit longer. But unfortunately, he wouldn't get that chance. Over the next few days, 3 of the 5 soldiers who were evacuated back to the States with Sergeant Cashe would succumb to their injuries. While this is sad, there is a silver lining. During the Second Iraq War, many casualties never made it back to the States alive. The families of those 3 soldiers who passed away were able to say goodbye and have that closure. Without Uncle Al's heroic feat, they would have never been afforded that opportunity. This is a hell of a story. One that speaks of a kid growing up in not the greatest of circumstances in Central Florida, to a man rising through the ranks of one of the greatest militaries the world has ever seen. It's a story that reminds us that character is not defined by the grades you make in school, and that leadership does not require titles and ranks. It's a story that proves that in many corners of America, a hero can rise and show the world that Black America sets the example in whatever we do. On November 8th, 2005, the sun was set on a great American. You know him as Sergeant First Class Alwyn C. Cashe. Put some respect on his name. Sergeant Cashe would be posthumously awarded the Silver Star, and many people attended his funeral back home in Florida. Over 250 people were in attendance, and when it was time for people to get up and speak about him, the line stretched from the pulpit to the front door. Clearly, he had garnered the respect of his community and the admiration of those outside of it, which is why very soon after his death, the Silver Star didn't feel adequate. It's been said that heroes get remembered, but legends never die. It's fitting for Uncle Al. To know him was to know a man of not just courage, but someone who impacted the lives he touched. It extended far beyond the men he trained, even those he had brief encounters with. In doing the research for this episode, I came across many newspaper articles and videos, and what I've always found fascinating was the comment sections. There are thousands of them, some of them as recent as a few months ago, like this one from Vincent 8380. I was floundering as a staff sergeant. For whatever reason, call it divine intervention, Cashe took an interest in my military career. He gave me the best advice I ever received in the Army. I was probably destined to retire as a staff sergeant, but after him and his advice, I was promoted twice and ended up retiring as a first sergeant. He made my career. Or this one from K. Bowl Dink. I had the pleasure of meeting him at 11 Mike MOS training at Fort Benning, Georgia, and serving with him in Korea. I followed his career path. I went to drill sergeant school and master gunner school like he did. He would always encourage me and push me. This man is the epitome of a soldier. He is what right always looked like. I will always remember his legacy. Legacy. That reminds me of what Uncle Al's father told him when he was a kid about doing good work. Remember, he said, quote, "Whatever you do, do it like you're putting your name on it." His dad was right. But when you know the story of Sergeant Cashe, I think we can take that even further. I think when you do it like you're putting your name on it, people will begin to put your name on other things, which is exactly what happened, and the campaign for greater recognition began. In 2006, Fort Benning renamed a training facility in his honor. In 2014, a Florida Army Reserve Center was dedicated to him. And in 2018, the local post office in his hometown of Oviedo was renamed in his honor. In 2021, Fort Stewart renamed its ceremonial grounds to Cashe Gardens. These gardens are used for high-profile ceremonies and division changes of command. And if you are a soldier going through a promotion, the promotion board will ask you about an aspect of Sergeant Cashe's story, and you better know it. But probably the biggest publicity to cement Uncle Al's legacy came during the 2020 NFL season. players were allowed to tape messages on the back of their helmets to promote social issues. On September 28th, Pittsburgh Steeler Alejandro Villanueva, who was an Army Ranger and Bronze Star recipient, taped the name of Alwyn Cashe on the back of his helmet to give the campaign even more support.
I felt that my decision to honor Sergeant First Class Alwyn Cashe was something that was very personal to me, due to the fact that in the veteran community there's a strong push to get him a Medal of Honor, which is something that the community believes that he deserves.
Finally, after much campaigning for 15 years from the people who served with him, the veteran community, Congress, and others, it finally made it to President Donald Trump's desk. And on December 4th, 2020, H.R. 82676 was signed, awarding Sergeant First Class Alwyn Cashe the Medal of Honor. Due to the transition of power at the time and the events of January 6th, the ceremony was delayed. But on December 16th, 2021, we as a country were able to honor a man who gave so much to us. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, Joe Biden.
He was a hero. He was a beloved son and brother, a proud husband and a father of 3 children. Sergeant Cashe and his family gave everything for our country. Their devotion to his memory, their years working to make sure that his courage and selflessness were properly documented and honored, is a testament to the love he inspired and the legacy he left behind. Sergeant First Class Cashe is now the 7th individual to receive a Medal of Honor for his actions in Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the first African American to receive it since the Vietnam War.
A legacy is important to a family. It gives us proof of concept and affirmation that great things can be achieved because it is in our bloodline. That is what I am reminded of when I see Andrew Cashe, Alwyn's son, who began his military career just a few years ago. But legacies are also important to a community. In an era where people want to rewrite our history, even though they haven't lived it, it is important now, more than ever, to learn from our legacy, as it serves as wisdom from the past while giving us a blueprint to start our own. Which is why we have the story of Alwyn C. Cashe, who forged his path and wrote his name in the annals of history. The proud son of Florida reminds us that many of us are called to do great things, even if the beginning of our story doesn't look that way. Because if you are willing to lead with love and work hard, your legacy can never be denied, and greatness awaits you. And that is why Sergeant First Class Alwyn C. Cashe is the American Sergeant. The Black is America podcast, a presentation of Owl's Education Company, was created and is written, researched, and produced by me, Dominic Lawson. Executive producer, Kendall Lawson. Cover art was created by Alexandria Eddings of Art Life Connections. Sources to create this episode include the United States Army, the Department of Defense, the White House, the Center for Disease Control, the program 60 Minutes courtesy of CBS News, C-SPAN, ABC 10 Sacramento, Dr. Amy Sturgis of Lenore Ryan University in collaboration with Learn Liberty, the Washington Post, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Los Angeles Times, the Orlando Sentinel, and the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. Be sure to like, review, and subscribe to the Black is America podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And also, let people know about the podcast. We would appreciate that very much. For a full transcript of this episode and others, go to www.blackisamericapodcast.com. There, you can read our blog, leave us a review, or leave a voicemail where you can ask a question or let us know what you think about the show, and we may play that clip in a different episode. Thank you so much for listening to the award-winning Black is America podcast, where our history comes to life. Until next time. Oh, wow, you're still here. You must really like this show. You know what? I can appreciate that. Well, since you're still here, allow me to reward you with a treat. So in the making of this episode, I went on a bit of a writing frenzy, so much so that I had to cut down and rewrite some of it so we didn't focus our attention away too much from Alwyn Cashe. You know, I like to pack every episode with a lot of educational value, but sometimes I overdo it. Some of the things we cut was background information from the Iraq wars. Some of it was actually condensed, but a lot of it was just taken out altogether. Now, you heard the B story where we highlighted John Horse and the Black Seminoles, but there was a C story that was cut, and that was about Colin Powell. You know the story. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of State, yeah, that guy. But I think many of us know the mild-mannered tactician and diplomat, but I wrote a story about him being about that action. And you know what? Allow me to share that story with you right now and go back 23 years from 1991 when Desert Storm took place and go right about here. It's November 16th, 1968, deep in the jungles of Vietnam. Major Colin Powell, on his second tour to the Southeast Asian country, is no stranger to the chaos of war. His first tour ended abruptly when he stepped on a punji stick trap, but that didn't deter him. He returned to Southeast Asia ready to serve his country and his fellow soldiers. On one fateful day, Powell's helicopter was hit and went down in hostile territory. In the chaos of the crash, with the helicopter ablaze and the threat of enemy forces closing in, Powell didn't think twice. Despite his own injuries, he got to work. Major Powell pulled 3 of his comrades from the wreckage and led them to safety. One of them was trapped under a twisted, burning fuselage, and with his bare hands, Major Powell tore away at the hot metal to save this soldier. Yeah, that makes sense. Sounds like something an Army Ranger would do. For his actions, Powell earned the Soldier's Medal for his bravery that day. Overall, his 2 tours would net him a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts, charting the path of a remarkable military and public service career, from National Security Advisor to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and ultimately becoming the first African-American Secretary of State. His leadership grew to such great heights that many thought he could have become president. Hey, not bad for a little black kid from Harlem. Okay, I've taken enough of your time. Thank you for listening to the Black is America podcast. Please subscribe and review on this very platform that you're listening on, if you haven't already. Until next time.